Hello everybody, this is Gregory with 5-Minute Catholic Apologetics, where 5 minutes every time may get you to the divine. Today we're going to talk about little acts of piety when receiving the Eucharist, and whether or not they should be done, and whether or not does it really matter. Now before we begin, let's start with a prayer. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti, Amen. Gloria Patri et Filii et Spiritui Sancto, secutor in principio, et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. So we have a lot of episodes here on the holy sacrifice of the Mass, why it's important, why we should go to Mass. And also I have episodes here on just kind of liturgical abuses that drive me crazy, or some quirkiness or funny things that you see in Mass. We also have episodes on kneeling to receive the Eucharist and some other things. I'm just an observational person. I just like to observe. And I noticed, like, when people receive the Eucharist, they all have different little acts of piety, or not even, some are the far opposite acts of piety. I would say that most Sundays I go to a very, I would say, pretty Orthodox parish, very large parish. Every Mass is packed, and this church is big. It's big. It's definitely not traditional Latin Mass. It's not ordinary Chair of St. Peter. It's not FSSP or Institute of Christ the King. So it's just a regular, large, pretty Orthodox Novus Ordo parish. It's going to have the trads who go and kneel and receive on the tongue, all the way to, as we talked about with the CEOs or the Creasters, people who are checked out playing video games during Mass. And it's just a wide gamut of people who go to this parish. Anyway, so during the Eucharist, you see so many different ways people receive the Eucharist. You'll see the majority of people, I would say at this parish, Our Lady of Suburbia, whatever you want to call it, I would say the majority of them receive it the way we were taught post-Vatican II. Put your right hand under your left hand, let the Eucharist be put on your palm, and then receive it, step to the right, and put it in your mouth. That's how I was taught. Back in 1982, when I had my first communion, we went up there like this, and then it was like this. They didn't mention anything about the tongue. Now, granted, this was 42 years ago, but they didn't tell you. They didn't say anything about us receiving on the tongue. Yeah. But either way, the majority of people, I would say, receive it like that. But then you'll get the variants, and some of them are going to be more acts of piety, and others are going to be like, what? What are you doing? So let's start with the more acts of piety. You'll definitely see at my parish, I would not say I would say it's about 25%, 30% receive it on the tongue, standing. We'll just say receiving on the tongue, period. Standing or kneeling. I'd say about 30% receive it on the tongue. I think that's pretty high compared to a lot of other parishes. They'll receive it on the tongue. Then I would say of those 30% that receive it on the tongue, I would say 50% kneel. Now, our pastor does not put a kneeler at the front. So if you want to kneel and receive the Eucharist, you got to get on those knees. Now, some people are limber and they can just drop on the ground with both knees and have no problem. Other people like me, I do a one knee because I'm afraid that's going to take me too long to get up if I go both knees down. Now, I have been to parishes that they do have a little, the little kneelers that they'll have in the adoration chapel or somewhere, and they just have it parallel to the front pew. And then when it's time for the Eucharist, they just bring it out and put it in the front, a little to the left of where the priest is going to be. So if you want to, you're in line, you're in the queue, and then if you want to receive while kneeling, you just, step to the left, get on the kneeler, boom. It's not much of an effort for the pastor. Just, he goes to the right and then back and forth. It's not hard. I remember once talking to a deacon of this church, and I kind of asked him what he thought about traditional Catholics, and he's like, well, I'm not necessarily a big fan because I think they're gonna drop the Eucharist or something like that. And I'm like, well, that isn't really but it kind of paints a broad canvas of trad cats if that's the one thing, the reason why, well, maybe you might be a little hesitant on trad cats, and I don't want to mischaracterize what he's saying, but I would say a lot of people receive it on the tongue. And then you'll see those who don't receive on the tongue. Some people will step to the right. Then you'll see some people who do the sign language. Now my family's from Mexico, so my people like to do the hand thing back to the hand. It's very common in Latin America. But I over-jokingly say, it's like sign language, like how many times the Latinos are going to be doing this. But it is pretty common to do that. they'll do that. I've seen people have it in their hand, step to the right, then they grab the host, and then they show it up to the crucifix, like hold it up to the crucifix, and then they receive it. I've seen that pretty common. I will see people who step to the right and receive it and then do the sign of the cross. That's pretty common. I've seen the shover down the mouth people. So they right hand, left hand, and they put in the priest puts in left, and they just right in front of the priest, just shoves it down their mouth. I've seen that. I've seen them maybe kind of take a step to the right and then shove it down their mouth. You see such a large range of the way people receive the Eucharist. And I think it is emblematic of a couple things. I think it just shows the lack of uniformity that we have in catechesis. Because you think the USCCB, in its good judgment back in the 60s, would just, send a memo to every diocese, archdiocese in the United States, and be like, hey, let's all teach people to do it this way and one way. That would be nice. Or even have it from the Vatican. That way, people from other countries, the Philippines, Mexico, wherever, Guatemala, come here. We're all doing it the same way. Do I think there is the right way? Now, this is the Eucharist wars. When I was in Italy, I went to the second largest church in Venice. Piazza San Marco is the famous one, but I went to St. Mary Ferrari. And when I went to daily mass, and I did an episode at the airport terminal when I was coming back from Italy, how the priest that refused to give me the Eucharist because I was kneeling. And he said something in Italian, like, he was telling me to get up, and I wouldn't get up, and he eventually gave it to me. But there is a Eucharist war, no doubt, regarding what's the proper way to receive it. And we're not going to spend time here because this video has already gone too long. I would say, historically, the early church, if you look at someone like Tertullian, has said that people did receive it in the hand. But some people say that quote from him is misquoted. But you look at throughout most of church history, it was on the tongue. And you could see why it was on the tongue, because your hands are dirty. There's just so many abuses that can happen if you put it in the hand. Of course, people have stolen the Eucharist. I saw it happen a month ago where a guy took the Eucharist, put it in his hand, and he pretended he took it. And then somebody noticed it. Not even an usher, but just some guy noticed it and jumped over there and grabbed it and told him, you need to consume this now. So even today, back in the 80s, it was the big satanic scare. People taking the Eucharist and desecrating it. And that still happens. Okay, don't be naive. That still happens. I, of course, a preference of receiving it on the tongue. If you want to kneel or not kneel, that's up to you. But to me, it's an act of piety. And it makes me sad when priests kind of get on the case of people want to kneel and receive the Eucharist, because I think if anything, you look at the percentages of the typical Catholic and whether or not they believe in the real presence, it's like 25%. So I think if anything, we want to do more acts of piety. Now, we don't want to go overboard where we're like the Santa Scala in Rome, where we're like crawling to receive the Eucharist. I mean, everything, of course, is in balance. But I think it would be better if all churches, this was an edict from Rome, maybe Pius XIII, the future next pope, could do this edict. Just bring back the altar rails. Bring back the altar rails. Communion by the tongue on the altar rails. I think in general it would bring a stronger belief in the real presence. Lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi, right? So if we're kneeling and we're in this position of supplication, I think that it would convince more of the youth to be like, oh man, this is something really going on. Of course, it would help if we had the right music and we didn't have 27 extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion, all these other things. But I think it would help. And I think that is the right way to receive it. Ultimately, does it matter? No, it doesn't matter. See, the only thing that matters is, are you in a state of grace? And this is something that I would say the majority of parishes and pastors don't push enough. Some parishes will say at the beginning of Mass, we welcome everybody. If you're not a Catholic, take a blessing. But I rarely ever hear it said before every Sunday Mass, if you are not in a state of grace, do not receive the Eucharist. I wish they would say that before every Mass as a reminder. So the only thing that really matters, and not if you like to receive the tongue, you like to do the sign language, you like to none of that really matters is, are you in a state of grace? That is the most important thing. Because if you're not in a state of grace, remember what Paul says in 1 Corinthians about that. It's not good. It made people sick. even killed people. We don't want to be receiving Eucharist if we're not in a state of grace. And if we're not sure if we're not in a state of grace, it's best to opt out. You think about prior to Pius X, it was pretty uncommon to receive the Eucharist. You would receive it maybe twice a year at the most. So we don't need to receive it. It's not a participation token for going to Mass. It's not. So it's better to do that interior life examination of conscience and realize, am I in a state of grace? And if you're in a state of grace, then ultimately it is up to you. Of course, I have a preference of moving toward a little more piety than the shovelers and other people like that. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter on the exterior. What matters is in the interior, as Christ says, right? It's not what eats you that desecrates you. It's what comes out of your mouth. Guys, post in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. What's your take on the different way people receive the Eucharist? I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care. God bless. And pray.